Give me the go ahead when you want me to start.
Oh, go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Jaime Cruz Jr., and I will be your MC. We will begin the Unemployed Council Town Hall meeting now. This event is sponsored by the Claudia Jones School for Political Education and the People's World. But before I present the panelists I would like to provide introduction for each of them. We need to do some house cleaning. Number one, this broadcast will be in English and in Spanish. Number two, while I am speaking, I would like to ask the panelists to turn their video off when they are not talking. Three, I will ask folks to type your questions into the Q&A section of the meeting. Number four, I would like to recommend that the audience not raise your hands. Okay, here we go. Let's get this rocking. I would like to extend a warm welcome this evening to our panelists, as well as to our virtual audience made up of African Americans, Latinx, Afro-Latinx, Indigenous peoples and nations, Asian and Euro-American workers. To our brothers and sisters of the LGBTQ communities, to Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and other religious denominations, as well as atheists, who will be watching and hearing this live stream broadcast. I would like to offer a brief autobiography. I'm a Puerto Rican born and bred person born in Spanish Harlem, New York City. I moved to Chocolate City on July 26, 1972. And in this space, that is where I underwent a radical transformation. I received this enlightenment while being at Rap Incorporated, founded by Ron Clark. Ron Clark just passed last year. He was a great human being. He established a regional addiction program in the tri-state area. And even though he's no longer with us, he transitioned with the ancestors, but the program is ongoing and he's helped thousands and thousands of Washingtonians for the last 40 years. I just wanted to make that little brief remark. Here I was introduced to African American Caribbean history. I was exposed to publications such as Muhammad Speaks, the Black Panther Party newspaper, and the Young Lords Party Palante, which was a Puerto Rican organization similar to what the Black Panther were doing, but applying it to Puerto Rican conditions in New York and throughout the United States. It was this place at Rap Incorporated that I was introduced to Bobby Seals, Erica Huggins, and local Black Panther Party members. I participated in the weekly distribution of free clothing, food, and organic vegetables to the community. This was we incorporated some of the things that the Black Panther Party was doing in California and elsewhere, so we were doing the same thing. Rap Incorporated even had a liberation school to teach the children in the community. Now, in 1975, I became an undergraduate student at Antioch School for Basic Human Problems. And in this environment, I learned about the philosophy of Marxism-Leninism, anti-imperialist movements of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And it was in this joint that I forged great friendships with folks like Damu Smith, who passed some years ago. He was a national organizer around against environmental racism, and he participated as a leader in the anti-apartheid movement during the 80s. Great human being, great brother. Also Kenneth Jones and A.C. Bird and Professor Jack Odell, who just recently passed away at the ripe age. I think he was like 98 or 99 years old. Okay, not long after I became a member of the Venceremos Brigade, an organization that promotes friendship and solidarity between the peoples of Cuba and the US. I underwent, I along with 60 other people met in Havana, Cuba. We were the guests of the Cuban government, and we were housed at what was named the Julio Antonio Mella International Camp. Julio Antonio Mella was a young communist, young man who fought against the Batista regime in Cuba, and he was assassinated. And so this camp of international solidarity bears his name. We were there to provide solidarity to the people of Cuba by constructing housing. Our social interactions with Cuban workers, youth, women, and the communities in general helped me in acquiring a social consciousness and a revolutionary understanding. On my return to Washington, D.C., I joined the Young Workers Liberation League. Basically, as a young communist league. Back then, that was the name they had. Before that, they used to be called the Boys Clubs. And then shortly thereafter, I became a full-fledged member of the Communist Party. I was convinced that that was the organization that I belonged to because it had a rich history of over 100 years, fighting against racism, structural racism, against women oppression, and all the ills that we face today. And since then, I have committed my life to the struggle against racism, against women's oppression, against patriarchy, homophobia, and for social justice. Allow me to make some brief remarks about the Claudia Jones School for Political Education and the Unemployed Council. The school is an educational project that plans to encompass bilingual reading groups, film screenings, educational seminars, conversations, and training for a mass movement. The conceptualization of the school arose out of many conversations with Arturo Griffiths and other people. Mr. Griffiths is a well-known Afro-Panamanian organizer and activist in Washington, D.C. for over 40 years. Finally, it came to fruition, the school that is, in January of this very year. Now, you may ask, why did we decide to name the school Claudia Jones? Well, she was an Afro-Caribbean woman from Trinidad and Tobago. She was a pioneering Black feminist, a political leader of the Communist Party USA, a theorist, and an educator. Claudia Jones was one of the most influential Black women thinkers and leaders of her times, whose theories and politics have shaped the world in ways most fascinating and unimaginable. The importance of the contribution to the, she made rather important contribution to the United Kingdom, the USA, the Caribbean, and Africa, is extremely and severely underappreciated, and many of those without an extensive grounding in Black feminist, communist, and liberation theory will have, unfortunately, never heard of her. However, thanks to the internet and social media, more of us are becoming aware of the legacy she has left. And that's why we named it Claudia Jones, because she's someone that that can guide us. She's fought many battles, and she was a fierce fighter. Now, let me say a few words about the Unemployed Council. I have a question. I'm not hearing the bilingual person translating Spanish, so I won't be able to hear. Is that correct? No one's responding. Okay. Now, let me just say a few words about the Unemployed Council. In moments of joblessness in the past, working people have organized Unemployed Council to coordinate the fight back against employers and to force the government to provide the necessary relief that working people need. For example, on March 6, 1930, demonstrators organized by the National Unemployed Councils gathered in front of the White House to demand aid to working families. Out of these efforts, the U.S. working class built a social safety network known today as Social Security, unemployment benefits, public housing, and many other social programs. A lot of folks don't know that, but a lot of that came from that kind of vibrant organizing during that period. Now it is this generation's turn to pick up the mantle and build a mass movement of unemployed councils that will address the economic needs of our multiracial working class in every urban, suburban, town, and rural areas in the country. Now, it has been reported that we have 47 million people who are unemployed, and those numbers are still rising. And that is not including those workers who are underemployed. The unemployment benefits for those who are receiving checks will end in this month. So that's going to create a whole difficult situation for these workers. And the monies that was for the coronavirus, it was $2.2 trillion. Instead of it being destined to going to workers for unemployment benefits to assist them with their mortgages, with their rents, and other social needs that they needed, the majority of that, or the bulk of that money, even though the language in the legislation stated that that's where it should be destined, but under the Trump administration, it was diverted and went to big business banks, and that's where the money is. $2.2 trillion, and that was approved back in May, and in 2 months, you're gonna deplete $2.2 trillion? I don't think so, but that's what happened. Getting back to our, so we need to activate these unemployment councils throughout the US to fight back for social justice against racial hatred and to expand democracy for all. Now, the panelists invited are from the following organization: One DC, DC Poor People's Campaign, a call for national moral revival, Will for DC, New Virginia Majority, and Brooklyn Manor Tenants Association. Okay, now for the first half of this town hall meeting will be a panel discussion, and each speaker will have 7 minutes allotted to them. We would like to request to the audience to please use chat box to ask any questions to the panelists, myself, or to the rest of the audience in general. There are other organizers who are monitoring this chat in the background, and we will do our best to engage with all of you regarding your questions. Now, this broadcast will be recorded for those who cannot be here, and it will be streamed on YouTube. With all that said, I will now introduce our panelists and let them each say a few words about the work that they do in the community and how we can get involved. Now, we will start with Cheryl Brunson, a prolific organizer with the Tenants Association at Brooklyn Manor in Ward 5 of Washington, D.C. She will have 7 minutes to make her presentation. So we can go right ahead and start.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, shall I say. My name is Cheryl Brunson, and I'm with the Tenant Association at Brooklyn Manor. I am the treasurer on with the Tenant Association and with the board. That's what office I hold. So I just want to just put out there that that Brooklyn Manor it's been a round family oriented neighborhood, has a lot of greenery, a lot of grass flowing through the neighborhood, and we have large families here. We have before they tore down block 7, the developers tore down block 7. In that block there was 3, 4, and 5 bedroom apartments, and it was kind of geared for the low income people, and single families, single moms and single dads, and it's very family oriented. It has generations and generations of families here on the property, and this is like the only property that some of the residents here know as home. Approximately about maybe 7 years ago, it was talked about redeveloping the neighborhood, and the residents and I myself was a little excited about it because the place it can use an uplift. It's just like a car. A car needs new wheels every once in a while, and so forth and so on. But it's not really necessary to really tear it down. And then if you do tear it down, then you should want to replace the people that's already here. Back in the day, the Fords owned this property, and they were getting ready to lose the property. The property was getting ready to foreclose because Mr. Ford couldn't keep it up. And the government made a deal with HUD made a deal with Mr. Ford because the residents fought for him not to lose his property. And with that being said, we won. And what happened was the government loaned them some money to fix up the place as long as they were, taking in people with Section 8 and other, financial problems that they had, they would back them. So about 7 years ago, they finished paying the loan off to HUD, and now they sold the property to different developers. They just sectioned it off. They selling it to different people, and we don't know who all is involved in this sale. However, we fought back. We took them to court. We went to the zoning commissioners. The zoning commissioners gave them the authorization to do phase 1. Phase 1 was tearing down the buildings, okay? Then they also gave them the authorization to tear down. They went to phase 2. Phase 2 was actually demolition the whole property. However, we took them to court and stopped it. So right now we're at a standstill, and we're waiting for the judge to make a decision. We've been fighting. We went to the Wilson's building. We talked to the councilmen. We've been to some of the senators. We talked to some senators. Kenny McDuffie is our councilman for Ward 5. And I'm really pissed off with him that he doesn't really care about the people and humanity, that he allowed them to do this to people's homes. It is really, really stressful to the neighborhood. It's stressful to the kids here on the property. They have nowhere to play. They have jailed us in. They done policed us in our own neighborhood. And when I say police, I mean we have security guards, and I've been here over almost 31 years, and we never had security on the property. It just wasn't really needed at the time, but it's just really, really been a fight. One of my neighbors was having company. They snatched one of her neighbors out of one of her guests out of her house and maced him in the face. People are getting locked up for leaning on the fence, sitting on their fronts. Residents are getting put out for little of $1. They're getting charged for property, destruction of property that we really don't have a maintenance. We started out, it was 30-something maintenance people here now. Now we only have 2 people. It's like 4 at the most. 4 people trying to maintenance almost 535 buildings. It's really, really been stressful. The maintenance done went downhill. That's another tactic to get us up out the apartments. And these apartments, when I first moved here, they were immaculate. Hardwood floors, bay windows. I mean, AC, the heating, you know, they were really, really nice apartments. And I don't know anywhere else that's gonna have this kind of space. I'm in my apartment as we speak, and as you can see in the back, it's really spacious. And you know, it's sad that that our mayor gave the developers $47 million to target Ward 5 to tear down this place and help build it up. Where the people gonna go? And they running our credit. When they move us from one apartment to another apartment, they running our credit. Anybody that move out of a 4-bedroom apartment, they're blocking that wall, blocking one room off and calling it a 3-bedroom. This cannot, as I say, cannot happen. And it's gonna happen. It's all over DC. I know DC when it was Chocolate City. Chocolate City was round about, and it was very nurturing. People was more loving, they were caring. The DC, everybody wanted to come to DC. When I went out of town, people would treat me with so much respect, you would have thought I was a celebrity because I was from DC. So that's saying that DC can use a facelift, but all these luxury homes that we can't afford, what's that all about, people? I tell you what it's all about. It's all about the money. It's all about bringing people from wherever they want, wherever they live, out further out, bringing them back to the city. We tired of being moved around. Slavery is over with, okay? They've been doing this for years, just moving us all around from parts of Southeast. First, all the blacks was over in Southeast. Now they ain't in Southeast. They all over there, pushing them out in Maryland. We cannot let Muriel Bowser and these councilmen do what they're doing to us. We have a voice. We need to stand up and let these councilmen know, and let these Muriel Bowser know enough is enough. Because we tired here at Brooklyn Manor. We boots on the ground and we're going to win. We're not going to put up with all this nonsense that these developers doing. They come in and they talk a good game, and when you open up the book, you can't understand a word. So this is what Brooklyn Manor is putting up with. We putting up with a lot of hardship over here. We need people to come out and speak up on Brooklyn Manor's behalf. And the reason why is because developers, they just point where they want to go. They do a survey. Whenever you see that little survey thing come up, you know something is getting ready to happen to your neighborhood. And ain't nobody exempt. Some people might say, hey, I own my house. I have a house. The developers will sell, they will buy you out. They will dig all around your house till every time you feel the train ride by, your house will be shaking. DC don't need all this luxury homes. If you're gonna do it, work with what you got. Don't be sitting up here taking people's homes. That's theft. And when you can't do nothing about it. So we just want people, please, just come on out and support Brooklyn Manor. We give out food every Thursday. We give out hot meals. We give out groceries. We try to make sure that we give help where help is needed in the community. We give clothes. We give back to school backpacks for the kids. We take the kids on trips. We are very active in our community by all means necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay. And that will be following Mrs. Brunson will be Mr. Brad Crowder, member of the Communist Party Labor Commission and the DC Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. He is an organizer who has led numerous labor organizations in negotiations with employers in Austin, Texas, in the Austin, Texas community. So is Mr. Brad Crowder? Oh, hey.
Yes, sir.
It's your turn, and please try to keep within the allotted time, please.
I got you.
All right, then.
Brothers, sisters, and comrades, I want to say thank you, first of all, to the Claudia Jones School of Political Education for inviting me and for organizing this town hall. It's very exciting to see so many participants. I see there's over 50 people who are attending right now. I think that's very exciting. Like Brother Cruz said, I live in Austin right now. I have been involved with the Poor People's Campaign. I was also an organizer with the Fight for 15, where I helped organize strikes around workplace safety issues and things like that. I have been working with the UFCW Local 540 to organize the last employer that I was at before I was put on unemployment due to the COVID pandemic, where I've been since then. And here in Austin, myself and several other people in the labor movement are involved in trying to reach out to our Central Labor Council to set up a unemployment processing program similar to the one that they've started in Minneapolis. This would allow people who are in the hospitality sector, including undocumented workers, to be processed through the system where applicable, and where not, they're raising money to disperse funds. It's only $200 a week in Minneapolis, but to disperse funds directly to unemployed workers who would otherwise not be able to receive any kind of aid. And so we want to bring that to Austin, Texas. And that's kind of connected to a broader problem that I think Comrade Cruz touched on. There's tens of millions of people on unemployment right now. I just recently read a Politico article today that was saying that the Congressional Budget Office just released a review saying that we aren't going to be looking at a full recovery, economic recovery, for about 10 years. That's going to be about how long it's going to take for our GDP to return to where it was. And our unemployment rate is going to be projected to be above 6% for the duration of the next 10 years. And that's not assuming that there's another shutdown and things like that. So the issue of unemployment is going to continue to be a major issue. I mean, under capitalism, unemployment is always an issue, but it's become an acute problem similar to what was experienced during the Great Depression. And so we're having to get together around this country to figure out how to address it. One of the things that we're discussing in Austin and talking about is trying to make sure that we're clear about the distinction between being an activist and being an organizer. Being an activist is extremely important. When you see something's wrong, you stand up, you move, you talk to the people that agree with you, and you go out there together and you raise hell and you make an impact. And that's very, very important. But activism alone is insufficient in our opinion. And it has to be linked with deep organizing around day-to-day issues based on one-on-one conversations, follow-ups, picking winnable fights that have a direct impact on people's lives, something we call deep organizing. Jane McAlevey is is a labor scholar who's been writing most about that, but she actually draws her research from the 1930s, in particular the Communist Party and William Z. Foster. So you can see she's not a member of the Communist Party or a communist, but as an academic, she noticed and understands that the type of organizing that was pioneered in the 1930s around unemployment organizing, where people were organizing in the neighborhoods, people were organizing at the unemployment offices, face-to-face, on the ground. Everybody knows about the eviction resistance movements, right? Where they would go and they would fight to prevent evictions or to crack open doors to return people to their homes. And that was because they had built the strong relationships, the organizing relationships, that when it came time to mobilize, the activist pool was much stronger because of the organizing that had been going on for a period of time. And that organizing, we know in the labor movement that organizing has to be given an institutional form, right? It has to be brought into some kind of organizational form. In the labor movement, it's traditionally been unions, worker organizing committees, and things like that. And we don't think that model is different or distinct in any way, and that can be applied to the unemployment organizing as well. And this is where the unemployment organizing councils or the unemployment councils come from. It's as we go through and we meet our neighbors, we meet our coworkers who are unemployed, we recognize not just those workers that are employed, but for workers who have jobs, that the fight for unemployed workers is the employed workers' fight as well. And if you have a question about that, whether it is, I want every employed worker to think about what it's going to be like when 20 to 40 million unemployed workers on August 1st are coming with a knife to get your job. It's everybody's problem in the working class, this unemployment crisis, and it's important to remember that. And so as we're doing that and realizing that and building these relationships, we don't want to just let these things flame up and then burn out. We want to build democratic institutions at the grassroots where people are able to elect or appoint the different representatives around their fights to where they can take direct ownership, democratic ownership of the struggle themselves. And so this is going to be a very important project over the next several months, over the next many months. But the most pressing, I think, is trying to understand. One of the things we're struggling with is understanding the balance between the need to have that deep organizing, but also recognizing the very real limits of where we're at in terms of our capacity and the desperation that people are feeling. So one of the things that is concerning is how we're going to build up that organizing capacity to push, not just at the local level, but hopefully to be able to push something like the HEROES Act through. But the reality is that may not pass. The Republicans have already come out against it. And so we need to be getting ready right now to be prepared for what the New York Times referred to as an avalanche of evictions. We're talking tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people even being evicted from their homes in a matter of weeks. Something really unprecedented in US history, at least modern US history. And so as we're building these institutions of struggle, we want to keep it in the context of what's going on right now. There can be a rush to construct organizational forms in the abstract and then hope to fit them to the conditions, when in fact we need to address the conditions as they are and make sure that that's what is informing the organizational structures that we're building. So we want to start with the organizational conversations, the one-on-one grassroots organizing, and build our institutions based on those fights and based on what the people involved in those fights think is appropriate, and not something that, a few people outside of the fight are going to think up abstractly and then impose upon everybody else. This fight has to generate its own institutions out of its own struggles. And I think one of the things that's going to be coming up in terms of the unemployment fight is the need to make sure that we keep in mind that there is the election coming up in November. And I'm definitely not going to give a pitch on who you should vote for. That's not what I'm here to do. What I'm here to say is that if we don't recognize what's at stake in November, all of the grassroots organizing is going to be a bust if the ultra right, not just Donald Trump, but here in Texas, we've got Greg Abbott, Ted Cruz, John Cornyn. The ultra right goes from the bottom to the top of this country right now. And if we don't defeat them in this next election, we're looking at losing the the Supreme Court for a generation. We're in a redistricting election. So for the next 10 years, the census is going to determine what the electoral districts look like. So you can bet in the South, especially like here in Texas, voter repression and suppression is going to be out of control if they win. They're going to do everything they can to take the vote away. The vote that many, many people fought and died to secure for every single person in this country is not something that we should take for granted, in my opinion. And so when we're thinking about this preparation for November, we don't want to be thinking about the candidates. We want to be thinking about the social coalitions and the issues that are most important to them. So for about 100 years, we've had a social coalition made up of civil rights movement, labor, other democratic struggles, like the LGBTQ movement, the immigrants' rights movement, and things like that. And it's been strong. And when that social coalition has been united, we've been able to make gains. But this last election, during this last primary season, the establishment Democrats did a lot of damage to that social coalition. We saw it in 2016, where there was a lot of lack of enthusiasm because people think that the establishment candidates are not going to carry their issues, which is fair and frankly pretty true. But we don't want to see elections in terms of the individuals. We want to see it in terms of the social coalitions. And we have to keep this popular front, this movement of civil rights, labor, at least to cross the line on November 3rd. We have to at least defeat the ultra-right by November 3rd, because after that, it's going to be knives out. And all of the establishment is going to be coming for all of the left, the working class movement, the democratic gains, all that we've been pushing towards and building over the past 4 years, really. They're going to try to squash that out. So like the Bernie Sanders wing is going to come under attack. And how could we expect not? The Democratic establishments are in the pocket largely of monopoly capital. The only thing that rescues the Democrats is the fact that the Civil Rights Coalition and these other things are involved as well. So we want to make sure in Austin, while we're doing this unemployment organizing, we're focusing on real fights in a day-to-day way that is not connected to this candidate or that candidate. It's only connected to the issue and the target, and that we're winning it to make a real impact in people's lives, that we're using these fights to build broader coalitions with all of our Democratic allies across the entire population that we can, in order to defeat the ultra-right in November, and then lay the basis to defeat the monopoly forces that now dominate the Democratic Party ballot line. And so that is not something that can happen in Austin alone. That's something that has to happen at a national level. And that's why it's so important for me here in Austin to speak with y'all in DC, because the work that the Claudia Jones School is doing is very important. The work that One DC is doing is very important. And I'm here not just to talk about what we're doing, but also to take the opportunity to listen to what y'all are doing so we can bring those lessons down here as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. All right, the next on the list, we will be hearing from John Liss of the New Virginia Majority. John is the co-executive director of NVM, the New Virginia Majority, who has organized for racial and social justice in Virginia for over 30 years. Okay, is he available?
I'm not seeing him on the panelist list.
All right, no problem. Then we'll just change the order, and then we'll move on to the next person since he's not available right now. Okay. So let's move on and present. The next speaker will be Will Menafield. With the Will for DC campaign. Will is a current candidate campaigning for DC City Council at large. He has represented tenant organizations and fought countless legal battles protecting community members around the country from evictions. So we'll be hearing from Mr. Menafield.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. My name is Will Merrifield. I'm a candidate for DC Council at large. I'm running as an independent this November for David Grasso's vacated seat. I wanted to use my opening remarks tonight to briefly talk to the current housing situation in Washington, DC. Before running for public office, I worked as a housing attorney at the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. At the legal clinic, I represented tenant associations across the district. These associations were, and in many cases still are, engaged in housing wars across DC. Many times, we frame these housing struggles in the negative, as in what are people fighting against. But I do not want to do that tonight. I think this framing, what are people for, or I'm sorry, what are people against? Often this framing reduces these struggles to one group of people battling against one specific developer or one specific politician. However, these fights are much broader than that, and they are happening simultaneously all over the district and all over the country for that matter. So tonight I want to reverse that framing and ask the question differently. The question I want to ask tonight is not what are tenants fighting against, but what are tenants fighting for? The answer to that question at its core, I believe, is very simple. Those engaged in these struggles are fighting for their right to continue to live in their community and housing that is both safe and affordable. Now, this does not seem like a very radical notion. In fact, in one of the wealthiest regions and in the wealthiest country in the world, it should strike us all as absurd that our elected leaders have not used the vast resources of government to accomplish this task. However, not only have leaders at both the national and local level failed to meet this obligation, they have presided over and maintained a system that has resulted in an acute housing crisis. And let me be very clear, DC's housing crisis is a political crisis. That is to say, politicians are allowing a small group of people, developers, to control housing policy in DC. These developers have in turn designed and implemented a housing strategy with one goal in mind: to maximize their profits. This current system has many defining features, but I want to highlight two of those features in my opening remarks tonight. First, this system is completely dependent on government subsidies. Every year, our local leaders give away hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars of public land, and hundreds of millions of dollars in tax breaks to developers. Secondly, this system inherently builds in the notion that there is not enough housing available, and therefore we have to give private developers more taxpayer money and more public land to build more luxury housing. The argument they use is that this housing will at some point in the future trickle down and prices will come down. But this never happens. Instead, what does happen is that currently affordable units are demolished and developers build more expensive units in their place. In fact, between 2002 and 2012, the number of low-cost rental units in DC dropped by more than 50%, while the number of more expensive units rose by 155%. The system does this because in order to maximize rents, which in turn maximizes profits, it has to build in perpetual scarcity. The end result to all this is the reality we find ourselves in today, and which is defined by skyrocketing rents, massive amounts of inequality, hyper-segregation, displacement, unemployment, and political corruption. Now, given all this, it is my position that no amount of tinkering around the edges of the current system will fix it. It has a fatal flaw in that its driving force is the profit motive. As such, it is designed to benefit the few and not the many. So my campaign is proposing a new system, a more rational and productive system, a system that is readily achievable and that removes profit motive from housing. We call this model social housing. Social housing is housing that anyone can access and pay only 30% of their income in rent. The housing would be built by the district itself, and because there is no private developer involved and thus no profit motive, all rent is recycled back into the buildings to cover operating costs. In this way, the housing operates like a co-op in that it's self-sufficient and it eventually pays for itself. This model of housing is not new. In fact, it is quite common in many other places in the world. One of those places that it has been most successfully implemented is Vienna, Austria, where 400,000 units of housing are permanently affordable and outside the private market. To put that into perspective, DC has 8,000 units that are outside the private market. That's our public housing stock, which is deteriorating around the people that live in it. So this housing program, social housing, would be accompanied by a jobs program to put underemployed and unemployed DC residents to work, building thousands of units of social housing needed to solve the acute housing crisis we find ourselves in today. I want to end by circling back to something I said earlier. I began by pointing out that this housing crisis is a political crisis. And to solve this crisis, we're going to have to create our own political movement. That means engaging thousands of people in Washington, D.C. to organize not only around ideas like social housing, but also around the broader concept of redirecting our public resources to meet the needs of the many as opposed to the few. This must be an anti-privatization movement. It means that social housing, this means a guaranteed jobs program. This means investing in strong neighborhood public schools and building public institutions that lay the foundation for strong communities. I'll end there, and I look forward to the discussion tonight. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Okay, I believe John is available now. John Lentz of the New Virginia Majority. John is the co-executive director of the New Virginia Majority, who has organized for racial and social justice in Virginia for over 30 years.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and thanks to Technology Admin School for having me pulling this forum together. I'll give a quick backdrop on, and I apologize for dropping out a minute ago. Lightning is flashing around here and the internet out here, but here we are. We started 13 years ago. I've been organizing in Northern Virginia and Virginia for about 40 years. And then 13 years ago, sort of a fruition of a large amount of tenant organizing and demographic and political sort of analysis, we formed New Virginia Majority with the notion that if you could fuse together the demands of particularly African-American folks from Richmond and Hampton Roads Tidewater with the multiracial, multinational Northern Virginia and new elements of the working class, or the new working class, we could actually pull together a political majority. I know I'm probably driving the translator crazy. I talk fast, sorry. And so we've been working on that. And so we have our model of organizing is large scale voter work. So every fall, basically Labor Day on, we talk to between 150,000 and 250,000 folks. Then we do high level sort of insider advocacy geared to state legislature. And that was a 10-year process, trying to flip the legislature and build a progressive core within the legislature. And then in the last year, we passed something like 70 or 80 bills that we've been working on for 10 years. It all started flowing as we had changed the sort of basic numbers on the ground. And then we linked that with deep organizing, and that's what I'll talk mostly about. So deep organizing, as a number of the speakers have already talked about, is really one-on-one relationship building. I'd say knocking on doors, but now it's often making a phone call or texting somebody since we're socially isolated. Identifying leaders, developing leaders, and then putting pressure as best we can to sort of achieve our objectives, and sort of linking that back around with the large scale voter work. So it sort of is hopefully a virtuous cycle. So what's happened since the pandemic and the shutdown in Virginia and the country is we focused quite a bit on tenant organizing. So currently we have 7 different large apartment complexes where we are organizing tenants, overwhelmingly in Northern Virginia, overwhelmingly Latinx, in Richmond, more African-American, public housing in Norfolk. But the thing that everybody has in common is extreme difficulty trying to pay the rent. And so we've been able to get some extensions on the rent payments through the end of June, but at this point, the governor has refused to act. So in terms of what we're asking people to do is basically reach out, contact, get involved with us, but reach out and contact the governor. The governor has the legal authority to stop processing evictions and has chosen not to do that. So one thing, that's primary. We feel like if we can stop the evictions, and there's probably, this is a rough estimate, between 100 and 125,000 families that are unable to pay their rent at this point. And it's my assumption is this pandemic continues and goes up and down and continues, is that number will only increase. And so that's our organizing. Demands are A, stop the evictions. B, the governor came up with a $50 million program statewide. We did the math on that, and we probably need about $1 billion. So it's increased the funding to actually meet people's needs. And then thirdly, in some cases, we're looking into corporate campaigns. Are there ways we can go directly at the landlord, if it's a private landlord, and put pressure on so that they will negotiate whether it's a cooperative conversion or at least a cap on the rents or rollback on the rents or resetting the rents at a more reasonable rate. So that's what we're doing with the tenant organizing. And then we also organize taxi drivers and Lyft and Uber drivers. I've been doing that off and on since I was a taxi driver and was fired for organizing in the early 80s. And so at this point, our drivers have benefited from the CARES Act, and we're getting a supplemental extra $600 a week payment, which ends at the end of July. The pandemic doesn't end in July. I don't think it has that kind of schedule, but the aid actually ends the end of July. And our fear is that there's going to be tens of thousands of folks who really don't have work, or have very limited work or very limited income, who are now forced to try and piece it together, and they're going to be losing about $3,000 a month in terms of the supplemental payment. And so what we see as our political task in this sort of moment is, are there ways that we can bring together the up to 100,000 tenants who are at risk of eviction, and Virginia is like the leading eviction state in the entire country, and link them with the currently there's about 350,000 folks on unemployment. I don't know how many are actually independent contractors, so-called independent contractors like taxi drivers and Lyft and Uber drivers, but my guess is at least a third of those folks. So it's really, how can we fuse the sort of and build the political power between those two sets of people? And then, so that's like our political task for right now. I would just, looking down the road and looking to a potential different constellation of forces in the House and Senate and presidency a year from now, and I mean 6 or 8 months from now, is getting us to start thinking in terms of what's been opened up by the pandemic, by the movement for Black Lives, and the change politics and policies I think we can have. And I'm asking us to sort of put on our thinking hats and really think in terms of power. And what are those changes that we can win that will actually lead to cascading more changes? And I would just point to democratic reforms. I would talk about how do you get majority rule in the US Senate. And I would talk about workers and labor rights, particularly for what I would say, and it's really one of the big advances of a short period of time, is the essential worker, which, remember, after 9/11, it was the cops and firefighters, and nothing against firefighters. I won't get into the cops, but they were the prototypical worker, right? That everything revolved around, and teachers too, to be fair. And now I think the new essential worker, at least when I look out my door here, it's African American, it's immigrant, and African, it's Latinx, it's people of color, and that's the working class, and those are the essential workers, healthcare workers. So how do we start developing policies that actually represent and recognize their rights as working people? So I'd say once you start doing that, and you got to look, when the right wing gets in there, they are ruthless in terms of cutting off sources of power and their attack on labor and all sorts of any way working people have organized. I'm just thinking that we need to start preparing our agenda for the future. And what's that look like in terms of democratic transformation, both in terms of how government functions and in terms of participation at the electoral and community level, and then what do we do around labor and redefining who essential workers are and what that power looks like. I'll stop there. And if people want to get involved with work in Virginia, I'll put my number, I guess, over here in the chat, or my email over here in the chat. But basically, we have work going on in cities, so-called urban crescent, from Norfolk to Richmond to throughout Northern Virginia, and welcome people to step up, whether it's electoral work or deep community organizing. Thanks again for the opportunity to talk with you on.
Thank you so much. The next panelist on the agenda we'll be hearing from, her name is Zila Wesley of the DC Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Ms. Zila is the chair of the DC Poor People's Campaign and regional coordinator for the recent march on Washington in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. When she's available, she can be.
Yes, I am. Hello, everybody. Hello. My name is Zilla Wesley. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the translation team. Thank you for all the backscene people that got this done. Also, thank you to the Claudia Jones School for having me with this.
Our pleasure.
Just want to say, like, we are expendable, and this right now, in this moment in time, shows that we are expendable as a class. We need to get to the root of this. It's a good video called and I'll put it in the chat in a bit, but it's about getting to the root of the problem, you know, and that we need to start chucking at this root for us to survive as people, because the strategies and the tactics of the other side are getting better in a few different ways. Like they are, you know, their whole legal teams are at protests now, all of that. But let me not get sidetracked. But about myself and how I got just started organizing. It's just being from DC and being here and seeing, like, my grandmother, she grew up in she grew up in Shaw, Columbia Heights. My mother grew up in Columbia Heights, and just having that family aspect of everyone on the block knowing each other, everyone on the block helping each other out. Because my mom always laughs, that's why she never knows how to iron now, because she had a lady who always would do her ironing, because my grandmother used to do hair. So all of that is how I grew up, how I lived, how I functioned. I'm gonna slow down.
Take your time, take your time.
So also with that said, you know, my parents were both teachers. My father is a retired teacher. My mother is a social worker in DC public schools, and seeing how unions helped. You know, they were both part of the Washington Teachers Union. And all of that was just very helpful on my development, and even just forming me a little bit at a level of just like seeing how schools were in DC, how DC schools were a tale of two cities. And how you can tell where they invested in schools, you can tell where they did not invest in schools. And it's easy to see. You know, growing up, you know, I went to all different types of schools. My brothers did as well. And just really knowing and understanding the problem and the crisis that is out there is just continuing to go and continuing to move. And really the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for More Revival, I like organizing with them purely because we are a fusion movement. We have siblings from all over, and we are just trying to get into work. Like I know Miss Cheryl Brunson because, you know, we are with and stand with the tenants of the Brooklyn Tenants Association, because what they're doing in Brooklyn, they're doing all over this city. They're doing this all over this country. They're doing it all over the world. Like, housing is a fundamental right. Like, we are being hurt. Somebody is hurting our people. That is a song that we sing, and it's gone on far too long, and we need to stand up and really start having our collective power and knowing it, because we really need to progress and move forward. Let me look at my notes. Yeah, because it's also one thing, like voter suppression. We need to really start and really understand that, because they don't want us to vote. Because just like this election, which I did love, our Ward 4 person, we have some new blood in Ward 4, and I'm here for it, and I love it, because we need new blood all over. Because how Brad talked about earlier, we really do need to think every election is important, from the trash man to the judge to the sheriff's department, depending on where you live, is ultra important, because it's really time to say that we need to step up and, you know, and start calling shit out and calling stuff out, because, you know, having collective understanding is helpful. And even just for my own political development, like unlearning some stuff has been very helpful. And that's one suggestion I feel like people need to, that's my one suggestion what like people can do, because a lot of people are like, oh, it's trendy now, and they're like, I'm just gonna like turn my Instagram all black for the day and I think I'm doing something, but you're not really doing anything. We all need to take a step up and a step out and heal ourselves and heal each other. And that, let me see, I'm timing myself too, so
No, you're fine. I was just looking at something that I needed just to be.
Oh, okay.
Fine.
Yes. So, because even they have some numbers, like if they invest one more dollar into early childhood education in this country, we can dissolve child poverty in a few years. Because the Poor People's Campaign, a National Call for Moral Revival, we came out with a moral budget of how we can really use our money to help the people. And it's a brilliant read. It really breaks it down on how, like, you know, we're just really so expendable. And like, the fact is that, you know, Mariel Bowser right now, especially my people who are living in DC, we need to stay on this because nationwide, she's looking great because she wrote Black Lives Matter in the streets. However, there's no hospital east of the river. Our Black women and poor women in DC are dying because of childbirth. Like, this should not be happening. This should not be happening. So I say this to say is that thank you. I look forward to more of the conversation and getting deeper into it later. Thanks.
You can continue. I mean, still, we have.
I'm at 7 minutes. I like to stay disciplined. So 7 minutes.
All right. It's up to you. No problem. Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. All right. So moving on along, and so the next person, next panelist is Ms. Rosemary Enduruza. And I apologize from Jump Street if I messed up your name. My apologies. From 1DC, Ms. Rosemary is an assistant professor of African American Studies at Georgetown University. She is an interdisciplinary scholar who studies how housing policies are shaped by race, gender, political economy, and ideology. So whenever she's ready, she can do a presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the organizers of this panel. Thank you to all my panelists, fellow panelists. Thank you to everyone who's on the call, who decided to share their evening with us in fellowship and study and reflection. My name is Rosemary Ndubuizu. It is Nigerian, specifically Igbo. It means life is wisdom, and that has been the case in my life. So I thank you for having me. So I am going to briefly talk about 1DC, and 1DC stands for Organizing Neighborhood Equity. We were established in 2006. We were originally tied to MANA Inc., which built affordable housing. We were a subsidiary before and called MANA CDC, but in 2006, we changed. We became completely a grassroots Black working class led organization. 1DC, our mission is to achieve racial and economic equity in Shaw and the district. We have been through the years particularly committed to realizing racial and economic equity through 3 mediums. The first one is community organizing. We believe that the building block for achieving racial and economic equity in the city requires that we do door-to-door base building, grassroots organizing efforts that deal with the material conditions that primarily longtime Black Washingtonians deal with in the city around work, wage work, and housing. And so in our community organizing, historically, we've done, our strategy has been building by building. So we have organized dozens of buildings throughout the city. We've supported tenant associations as they've done their organizing. Glad to see Miss Cheryl Brunson talking about Brooklyn Manor. We supported their organizing in their early stages. We've done organizing all throughout Shaw, and now we still support organizing with tenant associations in terms of establishing their tenant association, supporting some of their building, their housing conditions, organizing. But then also recently, the last 2 years, we've expanded our scope beyond building by building, because now we have over about 400 members throughout the city, active members throughout the city, and a much bigger base virtually. We organize in the tradition of doing movement work. So now we have increased our organizing efforts around conditions, issues that Black Washingtonians, but also working class Washingtonians in general experience. And as so many of our panelists have already spoken about, one of the key concerns is this eviction epidemic that we will be under. We know One DC has been organizing in DC arguably for the last 22 years. And so we know that this eviction pandemic is only going to be escalated because many of our people have been experiencing eviction and mistreatment for generations. And so as Ms. Cheryl Brunson talked about before, dating back to the alley, displacement of Black Washingtonians from alleys, then it became urban renewal, which oftentimes just meant Negro removal from different parts of the city. And on we continue to deal with the eviction and displacement pandemic. And so for us, what we are doing is we are organizing around cancel rent. We believe that it's important, it's imperative at this moment that working class Black people, working class generally in the city, do not bear the brunt of this man-made pandemic that, I'm going to be very blunt, the idiot allowed to engulf the entire country. And by making sure that we actually reinvest in the people to make sure that they do not lose their shelter at a time of a global pandemic. And so we're currently doing cancel the rent in terms of our housing work. And then we're also doing work around lost wages and unemployment. And I will talk about that briefly in the Q&A if folks want to discuss that more. But we don't think community organizing is the only medium through which we will achieve racial and economic equity in the city. We believe it's absolutely crucial that community organizing work alongside community education. We believe that the DC residents, particularly longtime Black folk in the city, have an intuitive knowledge about the material inequalities that they experience in terms of low wage work or housing, unaffordable housing. However, one of the things that we deeply encourage is that we pull together our intuitive knowledge and develop a shared political analysis about the structural reasons for why this happens over and over again. And some of the panelists like Will Merrifield spoke to the need to address it. At One DC, we say it plainly, we say the reason for why much of this happens is because we have racial capitalism, monopoly racial capitalism. We believe that it is imperative for us to recognize that capitalism, it thrives off of race and gender. We specifically have, we borrow from Claudia Jones. She is one of our movement ancestors, and we highlight her in our values. And the reason why we name the problem that way is for members to see, One DC members to see how monopoly racial capitalism impacts different segments of the working class. One DC, we don't shy away from having these tough conversations about how difference is oftentimes taken up by capitalists, taken up by sometimes faux allies to actually divide and confuse us. And so for us, our analysis is we can't truly win racial and economic equity unless we have a critical analysis about what is actually happening in terms of our material conditions. Sometimes we can't even see it, but it has its vestiges that we're always talking about. And so one of the things we actually talk about is Claudia Jones. I'm going to lift her up again. I love the fact that this school is named after Claudia Jones. She has an excellent piece that many of you, I'm sure, know about it, called The End to the Neglect of Negro Women, written in the 1940s, where she points out how the working class, and particularly communist organizers, need to take a better look at how the working class is oftentimes divvied up, divided, and fragmented in ways that actually hurt our ability to actually develop a united front. And so she encouraged us back then to recognize that the essential worker, before it became a catchphrase in this current epidemic, that the essential worker oftentimes was a domestic worker, and Black women were oftentimes required to do that invisible care work that enabled white working class women to enter into the labor market, enabled white working class men to enter into the labor market. And so we see now that analysis still holds true, even as in this current moment. Dominic Timothy Molden mentioned in the chat that the essential worker today is still overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly immigrant, overwhelmingly Black Washingtonians. And so recognizing that does not necessarily mean that we exclude all the other working class members and say we just forget about them, but saying, no, difference actually matters. And we need to have a critical discussion about why different segments of the working class are segmented and pitted against each other. And so the ways we talk about community education, the organizational medium is through LEAP, Leadership for Education, Action, and Power. We also have Freedom School, and we have other forms of community education to encourage us to pull together our shared histories, to learn from each other, but then also to develop a shared analysis. And so LEAP, Freedom School, and these other community education efforts, we believe is crucial because we need to have a sharpened collective consciousness. So when we make our demands, we're actually demanding things that would actually deal with the material conditions, but also monopoly racial capitalism. We're trying to slowly chip away at that. The last piece of us trying to achieve, 1DC trying to achieve racial and economic equity in the city, requires that we build alternatives, community alternatives. We believe that it is absolutely imperative for us to have these community alternatives, because it's one thing to theorize about how to develop, how to reclaim and create collective ownership. It's another thing for people to actually have to experience it and deal with the values and the changing of mindsets, because most of the time in racial capitalism, monopoly racial capitalism, we're told to either be a client or a consumer. And so in order to become a part of a collective, you have to practice how collectives work, the messy, contradictory, troubling aspects of that work is imperative. So in community alternatives, one of the things that we've done historically is create housing cooperatives. But then most recently, we just purchased a building in Southeast called the Black Worker Center. And we believe it's important for the Black working class to develop a space, to have a space where they can incubate alternatives to this economic system. So we're encouraging Black worker co-ops. We're also encouraging organizing around Black worker issues so that people can have a space where they actually practice these values of cooperative ownership and practice the values of participatory democracy. And so those are the three ways: community organizing, community education, and community alternatives, that 1DC believes is absolutely crucial if we're to win racial and economic equity in the city. And I'll just conclude by saying one of the things that I think is imperative that 1DC does so well is because we're able to make these issues of racial and economic inequity real for people by actually lifting up leaders from the community and asking leaders from the community to walk with us and also teach us and learn from us, and we learn from them. And so I think that that's something that's absolutely crucial, is that we encourage grassroots leadership in the truest sense of the word, but we don't tokenize and we don't, how do I say, we are working to not tokenize or marginalize their leadership. And so I think that that's something that's important in the community organizing work that we do and the movement work that we're trying to encourage.
Thank you so much. Okay, there's been a little change with last panelist. Schedule was Felissa Palau, but she's being replaced because she could not make it. So the next panelist that will be presented is Miss Shakira Mingo. She's a member and leader with One DC, a native Washingtonian, and has a long history of supporting community work. She is the founder and CEO of Focus Vision Consulting, which provides solution-based strategies for supporting entities that assist low to moderate income communities. So we'll be hearing from her next.
Right. Hi, everyone.
Hi, how you doing?
I am doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me on this panel. Thank you to the Claudia Jones School for having me. Thank you to my panelists that had went before me. And I'm thankful to be here. As Jamie mentioned, my name is Shakira Mingo. I'm the CEO and founder of Focus Vision Consultant. We help nonprofit organizations and startup businesses that service low to moderate income communities build their programs from the ground up. Our services include data collection and analysis, asset mapping, grant and proposal writing, research development, and program design and development. In addition to being an entrepreneur, I'm also a community activist in Washington, DC. I started out as a food justice activist, food justice researcher and activist here in Washington, DC. In my most recent published paper titled Food Apartheid and the Curriculum That Saves It, I used Geographic Information Systems, GIS, to tell the story of how, to tell the history, excuse me, of how DC became a food desert. And what I found was as the Black population as the Black population increased, the amount of grocery stores decreased, leaving DC, specifically Ward 8, my ward, shout out to Ward 8, a food desert by 1970. Currently, my team and I are working to create the first high school-led community support agriculture, CSA, in Ward 7, which is a food desert. And in addition to that, I'm also a housing activist. That's how I got involved with One DC. Housing is very near and dear to me because when I was a teenager, I experienced homelessness. And my first job in Washington, DC was a homeless case manager. In my last 9 to 5, I worked as a data GIS analyst for DC Housing Authority. After the coronavirus pandemic is over, the next pandemic we're going to be facing is evictions. And as someone that has gone through that before, as someone that has been homeless before, I don't think it's fair for us to have to go through that. No one asked for this coronavirus to happen. So the fact that we are being penalized through evictions, I believe is just not fair. And at this point, I am using my voice. I don't care if it trembles when I speak, to speak up about this issue, because right now, as one of my favorite ancestors, Audre Lorde, has said, your silence will not protect you. So this is a time for all of us to use our voices and amplify what's going on in our cities. As I mentioned before, being part of One DC, I have been able to work with them around canceling rent. Right now, we're pushing to cancel rent in DC. As I mentioned, after this pandemic, the eviction pandemic is coming. and the eviction pandemic will negatively impact people of color, especially single Black female head of households. And as that affects single Black female head of households, that's also going to affect children. Children have already suffered enough. They had to go from being in school to moving to school virtually. Now their housing can be in jeopardy because of what's going on. And they didn't ask for this, and they're going to be impacted. And the impact is going to show in their grades. It's going to show in apps like being able to participate in school. Like, they don't need that. So as we talk about canceling rent, I want people to really think about the children, because this affects the children. As Frederick Douglass has stated, it's easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men. So at the end of the day, the evictions pandemic, even though it negatively impacts Black communities, this is not a Black-white issue. This affects everyone. And I want people to think about that as they go into the other organizations, to remove the racial lens and think about the children. I'm about to post in the chat the recent Washington Post article. I hope it worked, about the evictions that I mentioned earlier. And I know that we had 7 minutes, but that's all I had to say.
All right. No problem. Thank you so much for.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure. Okay, so we still have about an hour and 35 minutes or so. We can start attending the questions that people may have that have been generated from the conversations of each panelist. So we can start doing that.
Oh, hi, May. Is it okay if I say something?
Oh, sure. By all means, go right ahead.
So I think we're gonna in the agenda. Oh yeah, I think we're gonna take like a quick 10-minute break, just so to give the translator a break, and also to let the panelists kind of take a break before we start asking questions and engaging. But yeah, I think at this point we can reconvene at 6. Oh no, sorry. In 10 minutes. So
right, so that would be 7:35.
So 7:35 we can come back. Yeah, I'm looking forward to see what kind of questions attendees have. Thought the panelists brought up some great points that I would love to discuss and engage with. So yeah, so let's come back in 10 minutes, and I'll see y'all then.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right, hey everybody. So if everyone's ready, it's been 10 minutes, so I think we're gonna get started with questions. So I have a few things to say right before we get into questions. I'll let everyone I'll take like 1 or 2 more minutes before I start, just to make sure everyone's back on. And basically, I'm going to say a few things, and then we'll get right into questions. And hopefully, this will be the majority of the event will be opportunity for conversation to take place. So I'll wait 1 or 2 more minutes. All right, so I'm going to go ahead since it's 4:36, and I kind of want to make sure we're staying on time for tonight. So, all right, so I just want to first say good evening, everyone. My name is Liam Carbutt, he, him pronouns. I'm a new organizer at the Claudia Jones School for Political Education. I recently graduated from American University in the spring. At the moment, I'm unemployed, and I'm hoping to become a high school teacher in the DMV community in the coming months. I just want to say that being a part of this event has really been an important educational experience for me. And I'm hoping to carry some of the knowledge I took from what the panelists said, and also just in organizing in general, into the classroom when I become a teacher. So first off, I want to thank everyone on the webinar for being here tonight and taking the time out of their day to be a part of this discussion. We appreciate and respect all of your time, and it means a great deal to us that y'all have shown up here tonight in solidarity with the unemployed and the tenants of the DMV. So thanks again to all of our panelists, to our friend Susana Saldarriaga, who's been translating this entire event for us on a short notice. Also to Jaime Cruz, who's been emceeing on a short notice as well. To Rob Bradley in tech support behind the scenes, and to everyone who helped spread the word about this event through their different channels of communication. So for the second half of this town hall, we're going to be opening up the floor for the audience to engage with any of the speakers or with one another. And so in order to stay organized, we're going to use the Q&A box that Jaime mentioned earlier to field questions from the audience. This is just because it's easier to keep track of questions and answer them as they come in, as opposed to the chat box. So please make sure to direct all your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And also I'm going to be addressing all those questions on a first come, first served basis. So if you wish to identify yourself in your questions or comments, we ask that you please mention your pronouns so members of the audience can correctly address you in dialogue. So we will also be fielding questions from the comments section of the live stream. So if you've been watching this event on YouTube, please feel free to type any questions you have into the comment section there, and I'll repeat them out loud for those of us accessing the town hall through Zoom. And so we encourage all attendees to raise any questions that they might have. The most important part of organizing collective action is dialogue. And we're hoping that this part of the event can be a space for getting to know one another, establishing a greater sense of community surrounding unemployment and tenant struggles, as well as making concrete plans for collective action in response to the current economic crisis that we're facing. So let's start with the first question in the Q&A. It's from Leanna Wilson. So she's asking, I'm not sure if any one of the panelists in particular can answer this. If so, just start your video and I'll call on one of you. So she asks, are you seeing any data that shows rent being raised on top of the evictions? Does anyone on the panel have any answer to that?
So I turned on my camera by accident, but it's not data, but people are saying it's doing it. So like the best data is people, but I'm also going to yield to my good friend at 1DC who can probably dig into this question a little bit deeper.
Okay, go ahead, Shakira.
So in DC, the rent moratorium is that they're not supposed to raise tenant rent during this time. But to Zilla's point, I had heard of that happening anyway. If that is happening, that's illegal because that's not supposed to happen during this time. And I'm gonna refer that to Will, who just popped on. I'm passing the baton to you, Will, because I know you can talk more about that too. But from my understanding, I knew that should not be happening at this time. Am I correct?
Yeah, it's illegal to happen at this time. But I think the thing that people need to understand in DC is that rent is so incredibly high before the pandemic. Two-bedroom apartment in Washington, DC, the average two-bedroom apartment goes for $3,100 a month. So even, without rents being raised, they're at such an unsustainable level that, as the eviction moratorium ends, which it will end, and the DC Council, they passed, some half-assed legislation that said that the tenants must be given the right to enter into a payment agreement. But once they're offered a payment agreement, if they can't meet the terms of that agreement because they're unemployed, because, after post-pandemic, just businesses aren't going to open like they did before, then we are, as, Rosemary talked about, and other panelists have talked about, we're looking at a wave of evictions. And very quickly, I think that what's important to understand from a housing, just like a systems perspective in Washington, D.C., is that there is no capacity for people who are going to be, on the streets due to this wave of evictions. The shelter system in Washington, D.C., one, it's completely immoral and no one should have to depend on the shelter system. But that shelter system as it exists is completely at its capacity because the housing crisis was so acute before the pandemic. So if rent does not get canceled, then we're looking at a second, a health emergency in the midst of a global pandemic, and a bunch of people, losing their homes and not having access to any type of shelter. So I'll just echo what other panelists have said. It's absolutely crucial that rents get canceled. And I think organizations like One DC, the importance of organizations like One DC is for people to come together and organize around those principles. But it's absolutely essential that we cancel rents.
Okay, great. Thank you. Maybe I had a follow-up question for any panelists who wanted to answer. Yeah, like I've heard a lot of really good things talking about canceling rent. I just maybe wanted to raise, and a lot of panelists have brought up great ways for people to get involved here. But I maybe wanted to ask a follow-up about how can people in this meeting, like right now, like tomorrow, be kind of getting involved in some type of action or some type of organization that is going to work towards canceling rent. Yeah, again, I know a couple panelists brought this up, but I thought it would be a good idea to rehash this and just in conversation, like while we have a dialogue going. So if anyone wants to answer that, please feel free to step in.
Okay, I'll step in. Well, I'm going to just say get involved with like organizations like One DC, get on their email list, find them on Facebook, find them on Instagram, and really see what they're doing. You guys got some contacts right here, do it for that. But Miss Rosemary, she popped up on the screen. I feel like you probably have more to add to that, so I'm just going to shoot it to you.
My sister, I was just going to
Rose. Oh yeah, sorry.
Lift up exactly what you just said. Find your local organization and join them. For us at One DC, it's becoming a member, but then we also ask that you're not just a paper member, that you truly get involved. That means that we have right to housing, right to income work that you can join. And that we ask that you, learn about our organization, our organizing values, and our movement practices, which you get to learn through our organization. So we ask that you walk with us and join us. We actually will be having upcoming actions. So depending on the risk level, we will televise which ones that are open to the public. And then we tend to keep internally, now that we're developing more of a security culture, we try to keep internally some of the actions that may carry higher risk. So like historically, we've done a tent city, we've done a number of actions that required high security and high risk. And so we're going to be doing similar with cancel the rent. That may not be the specific action we do. We have to have an element of surprise. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. If anyone else has anything to add on that, I'll leave the floor open for a couple more seconds, and then we can move on.
I mean, this is Brad. I'll say briefly in terms of organization, joining organizations. I'm a relatively new member of the Communist Party, but it's been a really helpful and productive organization to join. I feel like I've grown a lot in a lot of different ways politically by being involved. And it is a national organization connected around the country. And it's non-sectarian. So whatever organization you're involved in, the party's not going to tell you to quit doing that. It's not going to tell you to go take up some other kind of work. It wants to create a supportive environment to where everybody can add what the party calls the Communist Plus to whatever organization or organizing project they're a part of. So I don't want to give too hard of a plug for the party, but I do feel like I have to say that as sincerely as possible, it's been a really rewarding and productive organization to get involved in. And I'm really proud to be a member and to be able to take part in building that up.
Great, thank you, Brad. Okay, yeah, so just as also a quick note on that. So I think after this event, we're definitely going to send out information about everyone who is on the panel and information about how to get more involved in those specific organizations. But yeah, we really appreciate people speaking on like how to get involved today or tomorrow. So if anyone else has anything to say, like again, a couple more seconds, and if not, I'll move on.
I just wanted to say one thing. I'm a relatively new member at 1DC. I started in May. And if you're looking to join a grassroots organization, I would highly recommend 1DC. I've learned so much during my time, well, in this time. And they really just allow me to serve my communities and really be a member that can, it's just not about, like Rosemary says, it's not about dues paying, but actually like being involved is very definitely helpful. And so if you're in the DC area and you're looking to start and kind of hit the ground running with this movement and canceling rent, definitely look at 1DC.
Great, thank you, Shakira. Okay, so if there's no one else who that wants to add anything, I'm going to move on to the next question. So the next question is from Mohsin Sadiq. He's asking, what do people think about the demand for universal income? This seems like a pretty open-ended question, so feel free to answer Mohsin in the chat, or I mean in the Q&A. Provide an answer that I can look to and I can voice, or any of the panelists feel free to chime in on this.
Okay, this question I'm prepared for. Something has to give, because as the market dwindles and the job market becomes more automated, something is going to happen. A good example of this is the Ford Rouge plant in Detroit, of why like Detroit had a max exodus after their jobs. At the highlight of the Rouge plant, it employed over 100,000 people and their families. And now it only employs 7,000 people because our jobs are being automated, our stuff is happening. So it needs to be a good, real conversation that needs to be added. I saw Brad, you may have something to add to that.
Yeah, you were talking about the automation driving down like employment levels and that being connected to like a UBI or a universal basic income. I do think that the UBI is a tool that we should look at seriously, something that I think is very important to consider. But I do think it can invert itself in a way and look at the circulation side rather than what it takes to produce the wealth. And we run the risk of basically just becoming the middle people for the UBI. So basically, if we don't have power on how things are produced and distributed, if it just becomes a function of income, we run the risk of just being vectors for the rich to continue accumulating more wealth, where we're not quite as immiserated, but we don't have any control. It's just the tech companies and the other consumer industries can use UBI to keep themselves afloat without really giving any power over to us. So I think the UBI is important as long as we keep it in the context of who has the power to impose it, who has the power to control it. If it's not the working class, it's going to be used as a weapon against us. If it is the working class, then it's something that we can use to further our own survival and perseverance.
So any other panelists want to speak on that? Or anyone in, okay, so I see Taylor Kayam in the Q&A wants to respond and add something. So they're asking, according to the TKM, what's the average income of him? Sorry, I'm not sure I totally understand this question. If you could clarify, I can circle back to that in the Q&A. Until then, I'm going to go to the next question. All right. This question is from Molly Nagin. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing any names. Can we hear, the question is, can we hear about how to organize from the bottom up? Brad Crowder specifically brought this up, but would be great to hear on this from any and all the panelists. Thank you.
I can speak to that since my name came up, but I did hear some other people that were on the panel that were talking about organizing as well. So I definitely want to give other people an opportunity to give their perspective on it as well. But in my experience with organizing, it kind of comes down to a few critical things. One is being able to do, okay, first of all, I think it's important for me. One of the things I had to learn when I was organizing is you want to try to think about how to fight where you stand. A lot of people kind of go on like the activist merry-go-round where they're looking for some other fight that's going on. But the reality is like the overwhelming majority of people don't need to go anywhere to find a fight. They got tons of fights in their own lives, in their own families, communities. People are being taken advantage of all the time. So don't think about organizing in terms of linking up with people who are already convinced. Organizing is a way to bring people who are not convinced into the fight with you by convincing them that only when we fight together can we really fight successfully, right? So organizing is expanding the base. That base building that was mentioned earlier is the key thing. One of the other things is leadership identification. One of the things I had to learn is that the leaders are not the people who talk the most. Usually those can be misleaders. The leaders are the people who have followers. So they can be the quiet ones that never talk, but everybody knows when they have a problem, that's who you go to because that's who's going to have your back. They're the dependable ones. They're not the loud ones. And learning how to do that leadership identification is very, very important, or has been very important in my experience as well. And the last is making sure that you are thinking about structure tests, building up to a particular event. So let's say you want to organize a rent strike at an apartment. You don't start by going around asking for the rent strike, right? When I was organizing with Fight for 15 and we organized fast food strikes, sometimes we would organize them like one-off, like wildcat strikes, right? Where people would be like one, for instance, was a fast food shop that didn't have any air conditioning in the back. People were passing out from all the heat, right? So I didn't go and say, hey, let's go on strike. I said, hey, what do you want fixed? They told me what was going on. So then I helped them draft a petition, right? And you can think, oh, well, the petition isn't anything, right? The boss is just going to throw it away. Definitely, that's the point. Because when you sit down and you help people write their own petition, I didn't write it, they wrote it, and I helped them do that. And then they went and spoke to each person and said, hey, could you sign this? That's a structure test, right? It's saying, not only are you just saying that you want it, you're going to put your name on it. It takes a little bit more commitment, right? And so when people do that, they're taking a step and taking ownership of that struggle. And when you give it to the boss and the boss does throw it away, you can go and say, well, what are you going to do now? And now that they feel like they've exhausted those options, the idea of a strike is less radical or less crazy. In fact, it can seem like it's the only reasonable alternative. And so just making sure that you are, expanding the base, doing proper leadership identification, conducting structure tests in an escalating way, and then organizing structures that are under control of the people engaged in the struggle themselves. So in the labor movement, it's forming organizing committees at the shop floor. But this could be tenant organizing committees, unemployed organizing committees, but just institutions that allow the people that are engaged in the struggle, who've proven themselves by being leaders, by completing those structure tests, giving them the ability to graduate and take ownership over their own fight and their own institutions and build that up. That way, when there's other fights, like if you're going around, let's say the elections coming up, we've been talking about the elections, the general get out the vote tactic is to show up like, maybe 2-3 weeks or so before and say, hey, you gotta get out, you gotta get out, you gotta get out. But if we are in people's lives every day, if they've seen us be there when they're facing eviction, when they're facing food shortages, when they don't know how to navigate unemployment, and we are helping them not only navigate that, but also identifying their enemies to fight and defeat to win real victories, when it comes time for an election, we don't have to sit there and tell them what to think or what to do. We've been in their lives every day. And so now when we need to move for a fight like that, we have the capacity to move with much greater mass and much greater focus than if we're trying to do it in the traditional get out the vote method. And so that kind of deep organizing is what will allow us to lay a base for the day-to-day fights that really win new people to it and show them what they're capable of when they fight, while also linking it to the big needs around elections and mass national movements as well. And so when I'm talking about deep organizing, that's what we're trying to put into effect here in Austin. That's what we've been discussing in the Labor Commission of the party, and things like that. So I hope that's helpful. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Brad. Anyone else want to speak on that? I'll leave the floor open for a couple seconds.
I also agree with Brad. One of the things we do, one of the cornerstones of our organizing model is relationship building. You can't do any organizing successfully if you do not have deep and powerful relationships with everyone and everyone who's supposed to be leading the work. And that work is hard. Building relationships that are oriented towards the possibility of change is important. And so for one of the things that we do at 1DC is that we always say, tell me about your people. We believe in the Ella Jo Baker organizing tradition, where she asked SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organizers, to always center the people that they're organizing, centering their life history and saying, you matter, by talking with them about their life history and showing a deep interest in who they are and who their people are. Because like Brad mentioned, the quiet leader who may be the one who does the cookouts or gives the backpacks, like Miss Cheryl was saying, those are the leaders that have the deep relationships. And so we, as 1DC, work to try to practice having deep relationships with them. And so also like Brad, at 1DC, one of the things that, and thank you so much, Shakira, like Ella Jo Baker always said, strong people do not need strong leaders. And so what we try to do is engender the conditions for them to practice strong leadership. And that means having a reciprocal, and I will borrow this word from my fellow comrades, dialectical, because it can't simply just be like, we're going to come in and help support you doing housing conditions work or house anti-displacement work. We're coming in saying, we want to create a shared vision with you over not just your material conditions, but for why the structure continues to target so many of us in the working class. And that requires trust, that requires openness, and that requires curiosity. And so having to create those, that level of complexity in relationships takes a lot of emotional intelligence, takes a lot of patience, and we at Wendy C see that work years long. We don't think that you can be able to develop a deep relationship like that over a year. And so for us, we think it's important to be able to have that type of rich relationship. So then we can be able to say, now can we talk about community education? Now can we talk about community alternatives? All that work requires a deep level of trust and a deep commitment to collectively trying to move beyond the specific to the broader structural change.
And may I add something to that real quick, Liam, if that's okay? And that's super important, because it's a lot of groups that will come into communities without building relationships and will just use whatever group for their benefit and like leave people wounded behind, because like Rosemary said and Brad said, like building culture together, learning together, all of that, trusting each other, like having fellowship together is just super important for long lasting organizing relationships, because some people really do think it's like, it's quick, like I'm just going to come in, fix everybody, but then you're still like having that mindset that you're there to fix them and not we need to like rise together. So
go ahead, Will.
Sorry, I can't get my video on here.
Oh, no, you're fine. We can see you.
Okay. Just to echo what other people have said, I mean, in my experience, being a tenant attorney and quasi organizer, while I was also the attorney for a lot of tenant associations, I think what I learned very quickly is that in going into a space with tenants that are having, redevelopment agreement that's proposing to tear down their communities, a lot of times those tenants are ready to stand and fight and be radical. And I think that we live in this sort of, nonprofit culture, a lot of people call it the nonprofit industrial complex. But in my experience, there's a lot of gatekeeping within that culture. So I think when trying to build from the bottom up, the professional class, which I would be in as an attorney coming into these communities, has to just shut up and listen to what people are saying and be ready to be as radical as the people want to be ready to marginalize yourself in solidarity with those people that are fighting for, whether it be their housing, higher wages. I think that that's an essential part of coming into a community that, you're not a part of, to just be willing to be in complete solidarity, put it on the line, and shut up and just listen to people.
That's great. Thank you, Will. I'm going to leave the floor open again in case anyone wants to speak.
Hey, Liam, I appreciate what Brad and Rosemary said. I would just put a challenge to all of us in this moment with both a pandemic and Black-led uprising, if you will, nationwide. I just raise questions about what we can do to scale and with a greater sort of velocity or speed. So yeah, I believe in relationship buildings and all that. It just seems like there's a particular moment right now, or maybe for a few months, maybe it's longer, where we can push push things a lot farther than we would have imagined even a couple months ago. So I guess I'm asking us to sort of look back what we can do differently so that I'll start my video. That's all. I'm just trying to say we should challenge ourselves to figure out how we can do what we're doing, but do it to a bigger scale. We've got a moment where there's a lot of people out doing stuff, involved, engaged in the street. How do we get them more involved with our particular organizations and more broadly with the movement? This is a huge opportunity. Things that we thought were impossible just a few months ago, I think we could say are possible. I mean, 3 months ago, you wouldn't have said defund the police, right? And now it seems like it's a pretty, city councils across the country are passing that stuff. We wouldn't have been able to raise concerns at the state level of Virginia saying cancel the rent for 2 million people 3 months ago, but we can do it with a straight face now and actually try to make it happen. So I would just say yes to all of what everybody said, and let's figure out how to do some of the things with a great sense of urgency and an ability to grow our scale.
I'll just say to John's statement, this is Brad, just real quick. I agree that scale is a question. And one of the things I had to learn is that organizing is a skill, not a gift. You don't you're not a good organizer just because you're charming necessarily. To really be a good organizer, it takes a little time to learn those skills. In our party club, we actually have a staff organizer for an international union who is helping us put together a training program for the comrades in the club to help them improve. And we want to make those resources available. Like I said, Jane McAlevey has some great resources in terms of learning. I also know Labor Notes has a book called Secrets of a Successful Organizer. I'm not going to endorse every position that Labor Notes has ever put out, but I will say that when I was first starting to organize, I really struggled and it was difficult to learn the skills. And that book had a big impact on helping me understand what organizing looks like when you treat it like a skill and not just like, a hobby or something that you enjoy doing or something that you feel entitled to call yourself because you are a political person. Having to learn how to put the skills does take time, but the resources are coming out and hopefully they'll be coming out more quickly because I agree with John. We have to scale this level of fight quickly, and we can't send our soldiers into the field, so to say, without providing some sort of training once they meet the enemy in battle. And so I agree with John. This is going to be a major issue that our generation has to think about how to address, and we're up against the clock. It's not something that we can take our time on, something we have to figure out as quickly as possible.
All right, great. Yeah, Brad, if you wouldn't mind, putting any of those resources in the chat, that would be awesome. Thank you for sharing. I'm gonna ask leave it open for one more second. And also, sorry, Will, would you mind shutting your video off while other panelists are speaking?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Mine shows as shut off. Is it not shut off?
Oh yeah, sorry. That might be a problem on our end.
I think it's probably on my end. We have like bad thunderstorms around, so it might be on my end. But is it off now?
No, it's still on, but it's okay. Like we can just we can move on. It's all right.
I apologize.
No worries. So I'll leave it open for one more second, and then I'll move on to the next question. Okay, so this next question is from someone on the YouTube stream, comrade Dante O'Hara. He's saying, is there any success on organizing unemployment councils yet, and where, and what do they look like? Does anyone want to speak on that, about unemployment councils?
Yeah, I'm working with the people around the country on trying to figure out how to implement these unemployed councils. I don't think there's going to be any like clear like I said before, we can't just proclaim an unemployed council and then hope that it's successful. We have to build the relationships that can be transformed into an unemployed council. And so that's kind of like a sticky wicket that we're in terms of the pandemic, because it's just difficult to figure out how to do that one-on-one organizing right now. But I do know that, like I mentioned earlier, the Labor Federation in Minneapolis is running a really interesting program bringing unemployed workers in and helping them process and navigate the difficult, bureaucratic mess that is unemployment, SNAP benefits, COBRA and healthcare, any of those things, while also raising money separately that can be dispersed to hospitality workers, regardless of their unemployment documentation status. And so in Austin, myself and a few other labor leaders reached out to the Minneapolis Federation, and they were extremely generous. They were extremely kind. They sat and had a phone call with us. They sent us several resources. And so now we're in the process of putting something together to bring to our Central Labor Council here in Austin that would allow our city to begin processing that. With the idea is that it provides a central pole that brings unemployed workers together, helps process them while also bringing them face to face with the limits of the system. We can find those fights, those structure tests that I was talking about, right? So when somebody comes in to file for unemployment and they get denied, that's a fight. When somebody comes in to get an unemployment and you find out, oh, they're at risk of being evicted, that's a fight. So if we can have a place right now, it's very difficult to find everybody because unemployed workers aren't centralized in a workplace, right? They're stuck at home right now. So we need to have a way that can bring people together outside of just being isolated unemployed workers. That can bring them together and also allow those unemployed workers to be linked to the broader working class movement. There is a danger of seeing employed workers, unemployed workers, when there is just a working class. The only difference between an unemployed worker and an employed worker is the good graces of your boss and God himself. And neither of those things, I think most workers would be generally wanting to put their income on. So we want all workers, unemployed or unemployed, to be organized together. And we think the Central Labor Council will be an important place where this can be done. It'll also put us in contact with people who want to have fights. And so in terms of like a clear-cut victory, I don't think there's anything yet. We're still trying to navigate how to find our bearings in this very unique situation. But there are very important movements going forward. And I know other parts of the country I've heard with people who are trying to organize unemployed councils, they are also doing stuff, trying to connect unemployed workers to food banks. They are looking at tenant evictions, preventing tenant evictions, just anything that people can do to kind of get involved in the fight is where people are at. But as of yet, I have to be perfectly honest, it hasn't cohered into a single blueprint that we can use. It's still something that is trying to be mapped out, I think, around the country.
Thank you, Brad. Leave it open, just a couple more seconds. Okay.
Just two quick pieces around unemployed councils. It's going to be around when cutoffs happen, when tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people are cut off. So the end of July, major cutoff date in terms of the supplemental payments. End of December, another major cutoff for the extended unemployment. So I think in terms of organizing folks, I think it'll be stepping up in and around these points. It's not a crisis with monies coming in, but when it's not coming in, the crisis is there. So I think people should just be, building your organizing committee and getting ready for a moment when it's going to take off.
Thank you, John. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the next question. So this is a question from an anonymous attendee. So once a person without any organizing experience joins one of these respective organizations, what is the best way to be helpful? What can they do to prepare for the work ahead?
I can talk about that because when I joined 1DC, I didn't have any organizing experience. And the only thing that I brought to the table was just the tools. As I mentioned earlier, like this is not the time to be silent. Your silence won't protect you. So what I did when I joined, anytime they said they needed help with anything, if it was something that I can do and had the time to do, I volunteered to do it. You know, I always reached out to other like leaders and asked if they needed help with anything. Once you get involved with the organization, there's always going to be stuff for you to do. If your organization is planning an event, that's how you can get involved with like organizing to get that together. Phone banking, they're always going to need people to phone bank. They're always going to need you to reach out to and market what's going on your social media. They're always going to need people to speak up. There's always going to be work for you to do. So I would just suggest get in, find an organization that aligns with your values. But before you do that, understand you have all the tools that you need to be a successful organizer and jump into this new field. So as Martin Luther King Jr. says, you don't need a lot to serve. Only thing you need is a soul generated by grace and a heart generated by love. So that's all you need. And then once you find an organization that aligns with your values, and go and just say, hey, I'm new, I want to be a part. What you guys need me to do? And they would definitely, there's work for you to do. So don't feel like there isn't, or if you come in, just be honest and be like, hey, this is what I can do. This is what I can commit to, and go from there.
Thank you, Shakira. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say real quick, I think Shakira had some really, really great points. I also wanted to say, if you are coming in a smaller town or if you're new to it, try to be patient, not only with the people that you're working with, but be patient with yourself. A lot of times there can be a lot of pressure to feel like you got to be making the change right now, and it can feel very overwhelming. And some people say revolution is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so you have to pace yourself. But I think really it's more of a relay, and you have to be patient with the people around you that you're working together. Sometimes you have to be able to pass it off and understand they have work. And just be patient and be kind to one another, because it can be very tense and feel very overwhelming sometimes when you first come in. And just giving yourself some time to adjust to the new rhythm and the new things. And once you get it, it's really a transformative experience once you come into organizing and you begin to like see this whole new world open up. So yeah, I just like Shakira's quote, I think was really, really poignant to me. And I just wanted to make sure that there can be so much pressure when you come in. Try to come in with patience and kindness, because it can sometimes be a little frustrating at first. And we just got to all work together as best we can and be patient and kind with one another.
Thank you, Brad.
I want to add one last thing before we move on. Also, consistency. Consistency is definitely key. So if you're gonna do this, just make sure it's something that you can be consistent in, because this is the time to be consistent, along with being persistent as well. So if you have the time, and to Liam's point, being patient and kind. This is new to yourself, so definitely give yourself grace. But if it's something that you want to do, like you can't teach heart. So if your heart is in the right place, then you can definitely be successful as an organizer, and don't let the time deter you. From saying, oh, this is my first time. You never know what you can do until you put yourself out there. So I would definitely encourage you to step out there, and you'll be surprised at what you can do.
Thanks, Shakira. Okay, so if there's no one else who wants to speak on that, I'm gonna move ahead. So this is another question from an anonymous attendee. So for people who live on the line of DC and PG County, what are options in this? For example, if the person stays in Temple Hills, Hillcrest Heights, but once they cross the street, they're in DC. Sorry, if you could also, like, if this questioner could clarify this. I think they're referring to what are their options for organizing, but I'm not exactly sure if anyone wants to speak on that.
So I would like to speak on that, because even like the DC Poor People's Campaign, we had a rift on what does it mean to be like DC DMV? And I was like, DC has its own set of issues. Maryland has its own set of issues. And then we have issues and Virginia has their own set of issues. Then as a collective, we have our own set of issues as different areas. But I think it goes with the point of consistency. Where are you going to consistently show up and really fight for this and be a part of the community? Because that's the most important thing, is that we even have some people who were on our committee who lived in Maryland for a while, and then you know what? They were there probably for 2 years, and they're like, you know what, my where I really need to be and really where I feel called is to Maryland. So that's my feeling on it, because it's I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that.
Yeah, so actually I had something to add. Actually, go ahead, Shakira. Okay, I'll come to you next. But so yeah, I always thought that similar to what Zilla was just saying, that I lived in DC for a long time, and I always just all the icon activities, my communities were in DC, and I recently moved to Northern Virginia. And I live kind of right on the line, and I've always just felt more, though I feel part of the community in Northern Virginia. I've always tried to kind of gravitated more towards organizations that center around DC community, just because it's I have more experience there, and I feel more affinity towards that. I would personally, I would just say kind of seek out places and organizations where that are in places that you feel a sense of community or culture sharing with. If Shakira wanted to say something, you can go ahead.
I just want to say, I know the area that the anonymous person had referred to. I actually, that's where Iram Simal and all that areas. I was just going to say that if you're looking for an organization in the Prince George's County area, I know Progressive Maryland, they're a grassroots organization that you can look into, but there's also organizations that do a lot of cross-sectional work where they're not only touching DC, but they're touching Prince George's County as well. So you definitely want to look into those organizations. And as one of my colleagues mentioned, Zilla actually mentioned, you want to go where you're called to be. So definitely look at organizations in your area. But if you're called to join an organization in DC, there's nothing wrong with that. You can be the one to be like, hey, there's people on the line. You're not the only one that's in on that line where it's you're across the street is DC, but you're in Prince George's County. And there's as you realize, as you open your mouth and say, hey, there's people like me, we want to get involved, what can we do? Just saying that, you will realize that there's other people that's just in the same situation, and then you can create your own organization to do the things that you guys want to do. So that's all I wanted to say.
Zila, can I get in there right quick?
I was like, Miss Cheryl, I'm not running this, but yeah, that's fine with me.
No, I just didn't want to interfere with what you were saying, but I would just like to say that I had the opportunity to be with the Poor People's Campaign in Chicago, and that taught me a whole lot about unity, and it taught me a whole lot about about organizing and what it takes to organize. What I'm pretty much is trying to say is that I met people from all over the world, okay, at that poor people's event that I was invited to. And it opened up a lot of doors to me as a part of the association, the Tenant Association. It opened up a lot of doors, and it opened up my mind as well. But the point I'm trying to get is that, you know, with them people coming from all over the world to that seminar, it was just, you know, I'm lost for words, because, you know, any organization that you come in contact with or you start could literally take you to where you have people from all over the world. So it doesn't really matter, I don't think, where you stay at or where you come from. You know, the organization can go all over the world. And that's what the Tenant Association is pretty much doing. We're reaching out to, you know, the commercial businesses and stuff like that. And so that's just a start. But yeah, it can be, it doesn't matter where you come from.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Okay.
Okay, anyone else want to speak on that, or if not, we can move ahead. Okay, so I'm gonna go to the next question. So this is from Elise Keel. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. What should some goals be to motivate people in small towns? How do we awaken people to the need for things like more shelters, more public housing in places where they haven't existed before? Also, please let me know if anyone wants me to repeat the question. You can totally do that. Oh, but it seems like, Brad, did you want to say something?
Just a quick comment. I actually grew up in a really, really small town. I come from a really conservative part of West Texas, and like not from like a progressive or liberal family or progressive or liberal community or anything like that. But I've been involved. I did become politicized out there somehow, and it's just really tough. It's really tough to find that kind of connection. But in my experience, like, okay, for instance, I'll give you an example. This might help. This wasn't in a small town, but I think it translates because I have experience talking to conservative people. When I was working at my last job, the unemployment or the union campaign began in a conversation I was having with a guy who considered himself a conservative, evangelical Republican. He had voted for Trump like before I met him. And when we started talking, I, was talking to him about our work conditions and about how terrible things were and how ridiculous it was that we got paid, and just having those one-on-one organizing conversations. I would push back on him when he would talk about evangelicals, or when he would talk about conservatives, not evangelical stuff, when he would talk about conservative stuff and things like that. And, I was just patient, and, I would push back, but I would also listen to him. And eventually this guy became one of the main leaders of the union and has now like pretty much abandoned the Republican Party and his conservative ethos. But it took me being willing to be patient and listening to sometimes stupid things that he would say or frustrating things he would say to try to troll me. But everybody in these small communities, especially these rural communities, are really, really being hit really, really hard right now. And so they may not use all the same words that people use in the cities. They may not have been to college to get the training. But if you can kind of connect with their heart and, really try to treat them like a person, I've found that you can really build connections in places that you would not have thought you could build connections before. And those can be some of the strongest organizing relationships that you can really find. So just like I was saying before, be patient, be kind to people, but don't ever give up, and don't ever think that you don't have a fight just because you're not in the big city. Some of the most important fights are going to be out in those smaller towns around the country. If we don't have those places that are being organized and being brought into the struggle, the cities aren't going to be able to carry it themselves. So just don't be discouraged, and be patient, and stick with it, and we'll get there.
Thanks, Brad. That was also a really good question. Thank you, Elise. I'll leave it open for a couple more seconds. Okay, so let's move on. So this is a question from Norma J.F. Harrison. So what are you, all of you, going to say as you work to get maintenance when people holler at you that's socialist or even communist?
Can I say something quick on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Yeah, I mean, if I understand the question, it's how to respond if people say that a policy or things that you're organizing around are communist or socialist in nature. Is that the question?
That's kind of how I understood it. I can read it again if you want me to.
Yeah, could you?
Yeah. So it's saying, it's from Norma. They're saying, what are you, all of you, going to say as you work to get maintenance when people holler at you that's socialist or even communist?
Yeah.
Norma, feel free to put any clarifications of the question in the Q&A.
I mean, I think that I've had, this issue come up a lot when talking about housing policy in Washington, D.C. And I think I've had a lot of success with just having conversations with people and around the idea that the current system is incredibly wasteful. The current system, for example, of housing in DC, like I touched on in my opening remarks, I mean, it's public money, it's taxpayer money, it's public land, it's land that the city, the District of Columbia owes, and they're giving it away to developers, just plain giving away taxpayer money, public land to developers to build luxury apartments that very few people can access. So that's the current model. And you couldn't have a more wasteful model than that current model. It drives people into homelessness, which causes the district incredible money on the back end, and healthcare costs and shelter cost. The alternative, that I propose is social housing, which would be a non-means tested form of, public housing, basically, that everyone could access and pay 30% of their income. And because there's no profit motive, rents being paid would be paid to directly cover the operating costs of that building. So rents are being used very productively. And the district is employing people, to solve this housing crisis. So that is because the profit motive is removed, the profit motive being a wasteful motive when it comes to trying to provide housing to people. Social housing is a much more productive model of housing because all rents are being used productively, invested back into the building. And also because people are paying less money, they have more money in their pocket. People aren't rent poor. So that money that they have in their pocket gets recycled back into the local economy and allows small businesses in the local economy to flourish. So I think that, when people yell that you're espousing, socialist or communist ideas, I mean, to me, the idea is, the value of the idea is whether or not it is productive, whether it is rational, and whether it is something that, actually meets what you're trying to accomplish, which as a collective, I think we should be trying to accomplish employment and housing for people and a quality public education. So I think it's pretty easy to beat back those arguments, especially in this moment that we're in now, where we're just in this like, you know, hyper form of capitalism that is devouring itself.
Thanks, Will. Does anyone else want to speak on that?
I'll say there's an old song that you can look up that's called "You Ain't Done Nothing If You Ain't Been Called a Red." And so for me, like this evangelical Republican, when he would come, oh, you want unions? You sound like a communist. Oh, you want people to have housing? You sound like a communist. You want people to have education and food, access to healthcare? What is this, socialism? Yes, and I'm proud of it. Next question. Like I'm not gonna pretend that these fights are not going to be controversial, but in my experience, when people start shouting red, 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 that just means they're scared. That means they know you've got traction with the community. That means they know that they're on the defensive and they're trying to get you shook. They're trying to break you away from your people, trying to put you on the defensive. I won't do it. I'm not ashamed of who I am or what I stand for. And I'm going to fight for these people. And if people want to break with me because I believe that people should have healthcare and housing, that's their prerogative. But I'm not going to back down or walk away from it. And I won't be scared to hear those words because you're right. I have done something, so you can call me a red all day.
Thanks, Brad. I'll leave it open. Sorry, Shakira, did you want me to repeat a question? Or go ahead, Zilla.
And also, like, if they're truly like to Brad's point, if they are truly your friend, because I have one friend, he knows what I do and one knows what I stand for, and he will not, like, we will not talk about or have a political conversation because, like, we're in each other's lives. That's one thing we just don't talk about. But also, you know, what we do is for the people, you know, like we're doing this because we know that there's a better world out there with access and that we are no longer expendable as a class, as a people. And that's what, like, at the end of the day, like, that's why I'm here, you know? Yeah, I agree. Like, yeah.
Thanks, Zilla. I'll leave it open just for another second. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. This one's from an email. I'm sorry, I don't know the name. The question is, have people thought about organizing demonstrations in front of main landlords' homes? Maybe just also, as a part of the question, like what kind of demonstrations have been interacting with landlords? I'm interested in that also.
Okay, Rosemary, I thought you might jump in on this. I was working with a building above the Congress Heights Metro that was owned by one of the most notorious slumlords in Washington, D.C. And he had a business partner that was very politically connected. And One DC organized a march and a rally, multiple marches and rallies to the front door of that very connected person that was partnering with the slumlord, and had hundreds of people out in front of his house calling him a slumlord and exposing what he was doing, which was trying to push out working class Black residents from their home through neglect to the building. And it was an effective strategy. It got coverage in the press, and it led to that slumlord being removed from the city by the attorney general, because the attorney general got involved once that struggle was elevated. And a big part of elevating that struggle was, one, organizing in the Congress Heights community and then taking it to the landlord's door.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, sorry. Rosemary had to step out. She wasn't feeling well. Yeah, so she's not going to be answering questions for the rest of the session. Yeah, so sorry about that. So is there anyone else want to add to that? Okay, if not, I'm going to move on. So this next question is from Carol, she, her pronouns. In the fall, if school buildings open up and teachers are not teaching online classes, severe budget cuts to public education and teacher layoffs are threatened. What's been the experiences with either teacher unions or teacher rank and file groups or education organizations? Sorry. Also, if no one has to answer this one, if anyone needs me to reread the question, I can. If also no one has an answer, I can move on. I'll leave it open for a couple more seconds.
I'll just say real quickly that in my unemployed organizing right now, some of the most important people that we are working with are teachers who are members of the teachers unions. So one of the labor leaders that we're working with that CLC project is a president of a local teachers union. And we have several, a few people across Texas that are involved who are also part of the unemployed organizing. And this is very important. Teachers are extremely important because they have such a broad connection to so many different parts of the community, and they can function as a very important pivot around struggle. And so in terms of it's hard to say generally what's going on because the educational struggle right now and teachers fights is its own sort of thing. It's so complex and huge and important. It's hard to speak to it totally, but in the context of this unemployment organizing that we're discussing right now, I think teachers and teacher unions, in addition to all of the labor movement, are just extremely important. Teachers are very important. They see what's happening when their kids come to school and they hear stories of their parents being laid off or struggling, or, kids coming to school hungry because the food is tight and things like that. Teachers see this stuff every day and it weighs heavily on them. And so they have a lot of pull, a lot of clout in the community. People respect teachers. And so their fight is very, very important. And it's reciprocal. Unemployed workers and workers in general have to support the teachers' fights. But the teachers have shown that they'll come out and support us as well. So I'm really excited with the wildcat strikes that were popping off, like in West Virginia a few years ago. I think the educational movement and the teachers movement is going to be a major fault line for struggle over the next several years. And I'm really excited to see how that develops.
Thanks, Brad. Okay, so if no one else has something to add, I'm going to move on. So this next question is from Rachel. They say, can you ask how the panelists suggest our government transitions from the current housing structure to one where everyone has access, or share with us regulation that supports their housing ideas? If anyone wants me to reread that, I can.
Hey, Liam, I can respond briefly. People probably know what I'm going to say. But I think that it's essential if we want to talk about a human right to housing, it's essential to decommodify housing and remove the profit motive for housing. We'll never achieve a human right to housing, just like we'll never achieve full health care as long as there's a profit motive attached to it. That doesn't mean that there can't be private housing markets, but there has to be the ability to choose to live in an affordable unit that is out of the private market. And like I said, there's other places in the world that have been very successful implementing that. Vienna, Austria being the most classic example. In the United States, there isn't any regulation and there isn't any housing policy that's moving us towards a human right to housing. Quite the opposite. We have these neoliberal housing policies which seek to destroy and privatize, all public housing. The federal government stopped investing in public housing. They allowed public housing to fall down around their residents. And they're using that now as an excuse to privatize and demolish these housing units and push people off their land. I mean, Ms. Brunson talked about earlier, Brooklyn Manor. Brooklyn Manor isn't public housing. It's a different sort of subsidized housing, but it was 535 units of affordable housing on 22 acres of land. And the developer wants to demolish all 535 units, build over 1,750 units, reduce affordability, eliminate large bedrooms. And the local government gave them $47 million in order to do that. So our housing policy right now at the local level and at the national level is completely corrupt, and it is completely built in, this idea that things must be privatized. So, I mean, that's the reason that, I'm running for government, because I think that people have to present an alternative approach to this ridiculous policy that exists right now. And that's what we're doing by talking about social housing.
Brad, do you want to say something?
Just real quick, I do appreciate Will bringing up the Austrian model. I did have a chance to look at that before as well, and I want to say that that is a really, really tremendous model to look at. I think he made a point. It's like over 60% of the housing stock in Austria is publicly owned, and they have kindergartens on site, they have squash courts on site, all kinds of amazing things on site. And I wanted to say, when that historically arose actually came out of the 1920s. It was a product of what was called the Red Vienna period in Austria, when a whole bunch of socialists and communists were elected en masse to the city council of Vienna. And they instituted this model of social housing. And despite the Reds being annihilated over the next few years, the project that they had begun was so powerful and so popular that they've never been able to roll it back. So even 100 years later, it still remains the case. And that transition happened specifically because of what Will is talking about. People were elected and they fought, and there was a mass movement that got these policies implemented. And when people see they have power and they see that power can be used to affect their own lives, it is really hard to take that realization back. And it can stick around way, way longer than the people who started it originally might have thought. And so I do think that what Will is putting out in terms of this idea of a social model of housing and looking at Vienna in particular is something that has really resonated to me and has a history of really having an impact on the lives of Austrian people of all different kinds, all different walks of life. So the elections are important, is all I'm saying, in terms of getting this passed.
All right, thanks, Brad. I'll leave it open for a couple more seconds, and I'll move on to one last question before we wrap up. Okay, so this is the next question in the stack. It says, as a Baltimorean, the spillover effect of people moving to Baltimore for cheaper rent or to retire here is harming our already bad housing situation. Do any of the panelists work with Housing Roundtable CASA or Public Justice Center. And would anyone like to speak on that? Oh, sorry, that was also from Cindy Farquhar from Baltimore. Okay, so it doesn't look like we have any.
I don't work with any of those groups, but I would just, to Cindy's point, I mean, we're all interconnected, and policy affects people. You know, policy in the District of Columbia affects people in Baltimore. Policy in Baltimore affects people in the District of Columbia. Prince George's County was brought up earlier. I mean, there's constantly a working class migration back and forth between Prince George's County and the District of Columbia, because working class people are pushed out of DC, able to come back into DC, pushed out of DC. So this idea that I think is important to that question is that we're all interconnected in these policies, and that we should be fighting, you know, across cities.
Thanks, Will. Okay, so in their interest of time, I think we're going to wrap up since we're almost at our 9 o'clock ending point. But I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, especially the panelists, for showing up today and leading an amazing conversation. I definitely learned a lot. And I appreciate all of you taking the time to do this, like, out of your day. It really means a lot. I think conversations like these are incredibly important to have, like, as we're moving into solving like these problems that a lot of the panelists have brought up. And yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining this event too. I know taking 3 hours out of your day on a Monday night is kind of a lot to ask. It's a really tall order. And I want to say, like, the amount of responses that we got to this event, people who were really enthusiastic about it, was really awesome and really inspiring. So I'm hoping in the future we can have more events like this, and that this isn't just going to be a one-off thing. I'm hoping that the people who attended this event will be able to get it, reach out to the panelists or anyone else who asked questions in the Q&A about joining an organization and making this struggle a part of your daily life. I think, yeah, a lot of people said a lot of really great things about that, about just like putting yourself out there. And yeah, like just seeing what you can be able to accomplish with your local groups. And again, I want to thank Susanna, who's been doing a really good job with translating, put in a lot of effort for this, again, on a short notice. So thank you so much. The AV support, Rob and tech support, and also Jaime again. Thank you everybody for doing this, and hope to see you all again soon. I'm going to be sending out a follow-up email with all the information for the panelists, so you can get in touch with them. Yeah, we have one panelist who's running for DC Council. And I'll put more information about how to do research about his campaign and how you can get involved as well. So yeah, thank you again, everybody, for coming. And yeah, I hope you have a good evening, and I hope to talk to you again soon. If anyone wants to have any comments or like closing comments, feel free. Shakira, did you want to say something? Okay.
I wanted to say something. Oh,
okay,
somebody else gonna say something?
No, go ahead, Brad.
I just wanted to say again, I wanted to reiterate what an honor and privilege it was to be on this panel with the people that spoke on it. I hadn't had the opportunity to meet or listen to anybody, but the level of thoughtfulness was just far exceeded my already high expectations. So I just really appreciate all of the brilliant people that were on this and the things that were said. I am really excited about seeing what comes out of DC, if this is the caliber of people that y'all have organizing together. I think y'all are going to be doing some really incredible stuff, and I'm excited for y'all.
To Brad's point, it has been wonderful to serve on this panel with all of you today. And my final takeaway that I just want to leave with the audience, just remember, the only thing that you need to serve is a heart generated by grace and a soul generated by love. That's all you need to serve. As Brad mentioned, I'm gonna take this quote with me, Brad, fight where you stand. So get involved with the organization that's in your area that is fighting for a cause that is along with your values, and just put yourself out there. You'll be amazed at what you can do. And I want to welcome all the newfound organizers and activists. Welcome to the fight. Enjoy.
Okay, so also Jaime is going to say one last thing. Wait for him to unmute and start his video. Also, Rob, could you help out Rob with? Can you help out Jaime with that?
Yes, I just sent him a request to unmute and then asked to request to start video.
Okay, thanks. All right, so in the meantime, yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, this wouldn't have been possible without all the organizers from the Claudia Jones School doing great work about like getting creating a space for political education outside of a school and like in a community-based environment. And yeah, like this event wouldn't have been possible without them. Collaboration with people's work. Hold on, I think Jaime is trying to get on the. I'm sorry. I think yeah, we're gonna have to close out. I think there's been kind of going some technical difficulties right now with Jaime's video. I'll give him like one more, like 20 more seconds. Okay, so yeah, I think we're at the end of our time. So yeah, thank you everybody once again for coming. And yeah, I hope to see you all again at future events and with all the organizations that were present today. So thank you. Have a good night.